Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of Experimenter Curators Hub. Um, we are having 4 presentations today, so hope that you always stay with us through the day. We're starting with Devika Singh, who I will introduce subsequently. I'm going to do a very short replay of yesterday with us. So we started day one with Naomi Beckwith, who joins us from MCA Chicago. And she put across actually some key things for us to note, really also highlighting the fact that may often be seen as a critique of curators as generalists, but actually being generalists, capacious generalists, can also be a strength, especially when there is intellectual rigor, without going into sort of academic cloisters that don't allow for this bandwidth and this diversity in the representation of cultural practice, taking current political realities in mind, the role of the curator in a way as a capacious generalist. I'm going to hold on to that one because there is also within the practice of someone like Naomi, the work that goes into art historical readings that she thinks about also as deep baseline work. The importance of looking semantically and not only visually. That was something that she highlighted in response also to some questions that came toward her. Of course, reading in a way these sort of sonic performative histories that had happened through her examples with the Art Ensemble of Chicago and the AACM. Further, really looking at what is happening in museum practices. Within India and within South Asia more broadly, we are in a situation where there are a lot of private enterprises in the arts, the infrastructures for future and current museums that are coming from patrons of the arts. And yet to really look toward, say, the North American context, where there are other crises at play, which is to really think about the ethics of funding and this kind of way in which huge amount of fundraising is required by directors of museums to the level at which you also have then artists like Nan Golden who are challenging that kind of resource generation in the way that it actually acts upon communities who are in a way also directly facing the consequences of certain kinds of institutional fundraising practices. This is all simply also part of being quite alert as cultural players, taking that responsibility to be actively considering how we are audiences, but we are also responsible for what happens all the way on the sort of top of the ladder. Saying this, there's also collection building agendas that Naomi mentioned in terms of diversification towards gender and race, and where needed, corrective measures that museums like in Baltimore, etc., are building in terms of what it means to represent the work of artists in a way that we are displacing, let's say, the toxic narratives by thinking through a new kind of master narrative that also is narrated through collection practice. Naomi also mentioned the term Sankofa as being something dear to her that comes from the Twi language of Kana that really has multiple meanings, but one way to read it is go back and get it. It's a way of thinking about always remembering to look back, realizing that we are carriers of history, and yet there is this important measure to be taken in traveling the distance between past and present, between various points of origin, so that we are not hung up on a certain fixity that limits our identity. Also recalling here the work of Okwin Wesor, who in his paper Modernity and Post-Colonial Ambivalence, that's just something I'm kind of recollecting based on the first presentation, where he wrote, there is a dual narrative that is often taken to be characteristic of modernity. And he spoke about the kind of grand gesture of modernity and then the kind of minority or petty modernities. The first, he says here, is the idea of its unique Europeanness. And he, of course, was writing as someone more active within North America and Europe. And the second is its translatability into non-European cultures. This narrative argues for the mutability of modernity, thus permitting its export and enhancing its universal character, while putting a European epistemological stamp on its subsequent reception. This traveling character of this dimension of modernity as export understands modernity as emerging from Europe. And then if you juxtapose this with somebody like a practitioner like B.C. Silva, who's also an extremely important institutional builder and curator, very active in Lagos, but also in many, many other parts of the world, creating opportunities for curators and cultural practitioners working in informal ways, working in collective ways, working beyond institutional agendas. I think those are sort of figures that were recollected yesterday. And that we can, those interested in curatorial practice need to perhaps also look toward from our context. Shaina Anand presented to us from this familiar space of experimenter, but really took us very far back in terms of CAMP's practice. 2007 is when CAMP really took off, and what we had is this sort of way in which to really think about the larger ecology of Bombay and the art world of Bombay, but also the kinds of hierarchies within the artistic scene that enable and provoke, in a sense, the sort of wild and multi-layered kind of platforms that CAMP has brought into reality for all of us to actually access, and also all of us to at the same time contribute to, whether that's by attending a rooftop cinema viewing, or whether that's through really using the sort of archives, that annotated archives that are platforms like Padma, etc., that even challenge the temporality of the archive itself, especially when we're looking at processes of live editing that are possible within these platforms. We realize that the raw material is something, the raw material being footage, the raw material being the notes of a documentary filmmaker in terms of location scouting, the meetings of activists, the parallel cinema movements that have been generated very close to the social movements that determine Indian examples for us to actually think about with what is happening in terms of the political conditions that we are in today. Their work is also constantly looking to new formats, so whether that involves film programming within, also again the condition of the MIF or other kinds of film festivals, but at the same time going sort of journeying quite far, thinking about multi-screen work as live ensembles, which they did recently in Chicago at the Architecture Triennale, which again really brings the housing question to the forefront, but does so through legal documents, looking again at the history of social movements, using the performance lecture in relation to cinematic archival documents. So these are the sort of ways in which also the intimacy and the kind of, yet the publicness of a cinema space is something that they remain invested in, and then use through different kinds of media infrastructures. Also, one of the important things that I sort of took away from Shaina's presentation is, what does it mean to continue to create strategies for further circulation of one's work, even when one is disinvited from being a respondent? What does it mean to continue to create these layers of knowledge in dissensus and through interdisciplinary dialogue? And one of the examples for this was the annotated Gujarat and Sea exhibition that was one of the projects that China highlighted. Also, in terms of some of the keywords, perhaps, that I hadn't necessarily thought about in terms of how useful it can be for us, is the hacker term privilege escalation. And I think we can really maybe consider that, across various contexts, in terms of privilege escalation also being how to use your own authority and power as a player in the cultural field, how to use access in improvised, creative, dissonant ways, in ways that may be seen as parasitic, in ways that, there is again a quality in which this escalation is not necessarily the kind of escalation that comes through the sort of algorithmic power that controls and is actually tracing all of your navigation processes, but the kind of privilege escalation that is something that gives you the possibility also to think about what kind of future systems we want to have in our midst to control the bare minimum level of freedom and individuality that we have, and also negotiating between the digital world and the living world. Okay. We also had Nora Razian, who spoke to us via Skype. We are hopefully going to get some more notes from her presentation, since some of it was lost through the transit from Dubai to Calcutta. Phantom Limb is one of the projects that she really highlighted, which was also her way of telling us a little bit more about Art Jameel in Dubai, and it will also open in Jeddah, a platform that is many things, and an art center, a forum where artistic research really takes off from thinking about ideas of confluence, thinks about its location, at least on the Dubai Creek. What are the kind of critical measures that such an institution can take, given its geopolitical location? That's something that we can probably discuss more with Nora. But Phantom Limb, for her as a curator and head of exhibitions at Art Jameel, was a way to navigate through some of the troubling questions of heritage and archaeological iconography, looking at how artists take up exercises in the reconstruction of history beyond the clasp of nationalist myth building, which again is something that happens online and offline. Looking at destroyed sites under conditions of recent wars and ongoing wars, and the way that stolen artifacts that come from, say, the colonial past, but again, also ongoing militaristic interventions, how these can be not only reproduced, but also renegotiated in their meaning, and how perhaps a contemporary cultural institution can think about the future of museology as well, to an extent. So ending here this introduction, I wanted to just call on this really great interview with Ashila Membe, which is Thoughts on the Planetary, because I also felt it actually aligns with Nora's work to some extent, and with our first speaker, Devika Singh, who's going to talk about her exhibition Planetary Planning, which took place at the Dhaka Art Summit. So the quote is, "Honoring truth comes with the commitment to learn and remember together. As Edouard Glissant never ceased to reiterate, each of us needs the memory of the other. This is not a matter of charity or compassion. It is a condition for the survival of our world. If we want to share the world's beauty," he would add, "we ought to learn to be united with all its suffering. We will have to learn to remember together, and this doing to repair together the world's fabric and its visage. restitution will always be partial. There are irreparable losses that no compensation can ever bring back, which does not mean it is not necessary to compensate. To have compensated does not mean to have erased the wrong. To compensate, as Kwame Anthony Appiah underlines, is about offering to repair the relation. Her work focuses on modern and contemporary art and architecture in South Asia and the global history of modernism. She was previously SMART's Research Fellow at the Center of South Asian Studies of the University of Cambridge and a fellow at this. Okay, you will say.
Deutsches Forum für Kunstgeschichte, Centre Allemand d'Histoire de l'Art, and there's no translation in English, which I like.
She holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge and was a visiting fellow at the French Academy. And I was particularly interested in also Devika's research that really looks at networks of internationalism and artistic exchange through the colonial times, also changing the kind of arrow of art history toward international artists, critics who came to India, and through their journey, she actually starts to narrate how we can think about cosmopolitanism. So it's not always looking towards the South Asian artist's work as something that is having to travel internationally, but actually reversing those debates and conversations continually in her work. She has also guest edited an issue of Marg, which again looks at in India-France artistic exchanges, and that's something we can take up during the conversation. But for now, she is excited to discuss with us her exhibition Planetary Planning and also the more recent show Homelands, Art from Bangladesh, India and Pakistan at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, which is currently on view. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Hello? Oh, this is much better. Okay, thank you for bearing with us. So I chose to focus for this presentation this morning on two exhibitions that I recently curated. The first one, which Natasha referred to, is called Homelands, Art from Bangladesh, India and Pakistan, and is taking place right now in Cambridge at Kettle's Yard. And the second one was called Planetary Planning and took place, as you mentioned, at the Dhaka Art Summit in 2018, so the last edition of the summit. These are two exhibitions that are comparable in scale, but that raise, as you'll see, different questions. The first one looks through a precise theme, that is the Homelands exhibition, at South Asian contemporary art, and that in an institution in the UK, while the second one focused on international art that had a precise connection to South Asia, but that in Dhaka. And I will turn to the different questions that this raises afterwards. So just to give you some brief background on the first exhibition, it's taking place, as I said, in Kettle's Yard with its slightly esoteric name. It's the place for modern and contemporary art, in short, at the University of Cambridge. It's made of a house and its recently refurbished extension. And in the 1960s, the house, together with the collection, was donated by curator and collector Jim Eade to the university. The exhibition interrogates the notions of home and of displacement, which has, as you know, which have been absolutely essential for the modern constitution of the three countries, and it does so through the perspective of 11 artists. Some works are looking directly at the... Where should I point towards?
On, turn it on. There's a button on the side.
Okay. Is it towards the computer, towards the screen? So some of the works are referencing directly the partition of 1947, while there are other works that pertain to ongoing conflicts, instances of intercommunal intolerance in the region, and a smaller number of them are looking at similar issues of border disputes, but elsewhere across the world. Technology is failing us this morning, but here we are. Okay. So one of the things, can we just go back?
Arrows back and the down arrows down.
Okay.
Down arrows next.
One of the things, so it's the contrary of here. One of the things that very much brings these artists together is how consistent they are in the tone they deploy and in their attention to material and to image making. Something that resonated with me that was said yesterday by you, Naomi, is how aesthetics and politics are actually false binaries. I very much agree with that. Something in this exhibition that I should add, something that I'm doing is I'm trying to stay away from the essentializing claims that are sometimes made onto artists from outside North America and Europe, and that is, of course, in exhibitions in North America and in Europe. So while the theme and the works may be rooted in specific places and contexts, the works very much have the power to transcend these. And I should add that, as you'll see, many exhibited artists also challenge narrowly defined understandings of place and authenticity. And this is so not because of their uprootedness, but very much because of their complex understanding of place and of locality. So what I'll do now is I'm going to run you through the exhibition, discuss a little bit in detail the works that are part of it, so to give you an idea of what this actually means in the exhibition space. It just opened earlier this month. So one of the starting points of the exhibition is a new series of photographs by artist Zahir Shah. It's titled Argument from Silence. And Shah, as you may know, uses prints and drawings to intervene into representation of architectural spaces. One of the things she's interested in is how perspectival representation has been, as you know, of course, culturally encoded. And here in this new body of works, she's superposing 3 layers of history. The first one is that of Gandhara, and what you're looking at here are sculptures and fragments from the Gandhara legacy. That was, as you know, located at the confluence of what is now present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. The second history that she superposes to that is that of partition, knowing that many of these artworks were disputed at the time of partition. And the third one is that of Chandigarh. These objects, the one precisely that are in this series, are located in the government art and gallery in Chandigarh that was designed by Le Corbusier and is, of course, part of a city that was designed not only by Le Corbusier, but as we know, other European and Indian architects, and that because Lahore, of course, the former capital of undivided Punjab, went to Pakistan. So the history of objects, of architecture, and of nations are overlapping here, and Shah renders this with what looks like heavily marked and scarred surfaces. This is more apparent here, and she's focusing in particular in between spaces, interstices between objects within the museum. This series is set against an ongoing photographic project by Delhi-based artist Sarab Bora, which is titled Snow and addresses Kashmir. Both Sarab and Munam Wasif, who's also featured in the exhibition, are photographers who, as you know, use a direct visual language, but one that is less reactive, nevertheless, in its working methods, in the working methods that lead to these images. Neither, as you'll see, are actually capturing direct images of violence. The title of this series, Snow, derives from the fact that, as you know, of course, many Indians used to go to Kashmir, especially to Gulmarg, to witness snow. And we have a series of works that is articulated around the 4 different seasons, moving from the winter to the spring, summer, and the fall. Most importantly, it's articulated around a number of unsettling clues that cumulatively tells you a history of violence. And there are, at least for those who can read these, also precise episodes that are referred to, including for Sarab in 2016, the killing of Burhan Wani. And there's a portrait, which is not part of the series that is exhibited, but is part of the wider ongoing body of works of his, a portrait of Engineer Rashid. You can also see how this series is interspersed with moments of intense calm and beauties interspersed within these clues. And here you have above the bed, the hotel bed in which he stays, images of the sort of bucolic paintings of Kashmir that used to circulate in India. In the case of Munim Vasif, he's done a new body of work on the Rohingyas. This is what you can see here on the right-hand side. Something I should highlight is that Munim Vasif has been photographing and researching in these camps for 10 years. And this is the first time that a body of work coming out of this research is coming out. And I was very happy to find out that there will be an even more ambitious presentation of that work that will soon be exhibited in the region and in Bangladesh. What you see here are objects that belong to Rohingyas. I just have a few details that I'm showing you. So some of these are rare objects, precious objects, deeds, photographs, the sort of objects that you would take with you in exile that would then, excuse me, take on evidentiary value. They are served, you can use them to prove marital status and so forth. And others are makeshift objects. Objects that are made in the camps. You have in this series some makeshift toys, and you also have more mundane objects, such as a skin lotion called Spring Song. It's a Thai skin lotion, and the series takes its title from it. These images were made in makeshift camps, in makeshift studios, Munim Vasif basically invited a lot of people to bring objects to him, and he used that as an opportunity for also to get the stories of these people. I also included 3 works by Zarina. This is a work titled Without Destination, and it was made in 2016 in reaction to migrants crossing the Mediterranean and at the beginning of the so-called migrant crisis in Europe. The title and the diminutive scale of Zarina's work indicate really, I would say, the artist's despair. You have 2 brittle white lines here that run across the surface and across these white papers that are assembled to take the shape, of course, of a boat. There's another series in the exhibition titled These Cities Blotted into the Wilderness that you can see here. And I have 2 details of the series that was made in 2003. One of the city of Ahmedabad, and that is why I referenced the date, and one of New York, where the artist moved in the 1970s. And this is a beautiful abstracted representation, of course, of the city. In the same gallery, there's a straightforward and very effective new film by Yasmin Jahan Nupur titled Film. And the camera basically follows the artist as she walks up a hill. Nupur explained to me that in partnership with international investors, the Bangladeshi government plans to set up an industrial zone on the land that once was occupied by her family and by villagers, the neighboring villagers. This is what you see here. You see Nupur looking at that landscape, which will soon be radically transformed. The work evokes, of course, the transformation of landscape through industrial activity, but also the personal loss that will ensue. It was made also after Nupur was unsure whether she would be able to return to that land. Another work, so this is going down. Another work that takes its origin in the same geographical region, The Song of the Ground, a recent work by Shilpa Gupta. I don't have a video, but I can describe the work to you. So it's basically relies on the collision of 2 stones, 2 visually and naturally similar elements. The stones were collected in the Teesta River, so that flows, of course, from India into Bangladesh, and as we well know, also follows the border where one of the longest barriers is being built between India and Bangladesh, officially, of course, to prevent smuggling from Bangladesh into India. Because of this work and the sound, the sort of visceral sound that it creates in the exhibition space, that also becomes a really important element in the gallery and also provides a different element, an additional element for the reading of the adjacent works. Here we are. In the adjacent gallery, in the other gallery, I wanted to use and to introduce the distance that comes from humor and irony and its double vision. And this is achieved through a triptych by Bani Abidi. What you're seeing here is a still from her work from the early 2000s titled The News. And in the triptych, you also have a work titled Anthems and another one titled Mangoes. And these work very much mock, if you will, the everyday working of Indo-Pakistani national rivalry. So as you can see here, and many of you probably know this work, you have Bani Abidi performing both anchor women. The one to the right-hand side is a sort of a Doordarshan copy. Is meant to look resolutely Indian. She speaks in heavily Sanskritized Hindi, and she's telling you about a very absurd news item, actually. And you have her reverse Pakistani equivalent on the left-hand side. On the 3rd of December, that is on Tuesday, Nikhil Chopra will be making a performance in the exhibition space, and we already have 4 drawings and a shelter that he used in Cuba at the Havana Biennial in 2015 for one of his performances. It's the shelter in which he lived, the drawings he made looking at the architecture that surrounded him, the props, and the costumes that he used on that occasion. This crossing of media and the making of drawings really during his performances characterize Chopra's work. And I think it also helps us interrogate the role of art and of photographic representation for the making of home and of belonging. What I should highlight is that to the left, or to the left inside the shelter, you have a statue of Cuban revolutionary hero Carlos Manuel de Cespedes, which stands on the Plaza de Armas, this historical square where the performance took place. And it's interesting to see how colonial legacies in their different manifestations and in a very subtle way actually run through several works by Nikhil Chopra. This is also the case in the work, and the new PowerPoint was not downloaded, so I'll have to describe it to you. This is also the case in a work that is exhibited in the same exhibition titled the Cine Film Series by Desmond Lazaro, in which the artist bases himself on the Cine Film archives of his father to depict the story of the making of British identity in the 1960s. And that is so because his family, which comes originally from Madras, then migrated to Burma and eventually to Leeds. And the image I wanted to show you is that of the brother of the artist looking back at the camera in this painting by Lazaro. In front, or rather behind him, you have Buckingham Palace and what he's trying to convey through that. Finally, I'll end for this exhibition with new works that were made by Iftikhar Dadi and Elizabeth Dadi. These are 3 neon works in total in the show. And their visual language, as you can see, is very much indebted to street signage and the popular urban culture of South Asia. It felt particularly important because of that to orient 2 of these towards the outside. What you're looking at, so inside the flower that you saw is the national flower of Bangladesh, the Shapla, the water lily. And here to the right, you have India's Padma, and not Pakistan's, but Afghanistan's Lale. The series, which is called Efflorescence, draws our attention to the way seemingly beautiful and, if you will, benign flowers, which also spread across national borders, are actually paradoxically used as national emblems. And because of that, it felt, or primarily because of that, that Pakistan would be skipped because it would not be true to the spirit of what the artists are trying to achieve if we had these 3 flowers standing for the 3 countries. So, as I mentioned earlier, the works in the exhibition, while often relating to precise places, cities, regions, but also conflicts and their particular contexts, all transcend these. And yet, at the same time, one question I had to address when curating the exhibition is how should artworks that were made not necessarily with a particular audience, but with nevertheless still specific historical or political references in mind, how should these be, if you will, presented in another context? One in which audiences may not necessarily be cognizant of such references or informative background, and that, of course, without reducing the artworks to these either. And this is also one of the reasons why I deliberately chose to work with artists who are clearly working within media, styles, and currents that cannot easily be associated with the subcontinent. Something that I argue in my work is really how art in the region in South Asia and elsewhere too has been co-constituted by local, national, and global political pressures, artistic imaginations, and mobility, so that these different geographical scales and lenses of analysis should always be thought, I would say, in conjunction with one another. And as a result, when addressing this question, I tried not to reduce, of course, the works to either of these frameworks. So moving now to the second exhibition that I want to tell you about. This was the exhibition Planetary Planning that I curated at the Dhaka Art Summit in 2018. In this case, I used, as you mentioned earlier, Natasha, the Nehru Memorial Lecture by Buckminster Fuller, which he gave in Delhi, he delivered in Delhi in 1969 as a starting point for the exhibition. So in this case, it was a historical starting point. I came across this little-known lecture in the context of my book research on art in India after independence, which in short looks at overlooked instances of artistic and intellectual exchanges happening in India in the first decades after independence. This lecture fascinated me first for its content. Fuller claims at some point, I'm quoting him here, that India should declare itself to be the first inherent home of world man. It should renounce, I'm paraphrasing here, sovereign claims, open up its citizenship, and become a cradle for all humanity, no less. Second, Fuller was concerned with creating a more equitable division of resources and technology. He believed that his geodesic structure could help solve India's housing problem. And his ideas were, of course, utopian, but they differed, and that's what interests me, from contemporaneous spiritual approaches to India. It was, in short, the social implications of his ideas and his inventions that structured his engagement with India and continue to make his thought relevant. The lecture also belongs to a rich history of international exchanges that happened in South Asia, with the Nehru Memorial Lecture actually only being one instance of Fuller's engagement with the country. So taking the lecture as a starting point, the exhibition explored different instances of planetary planning, be it astronomical, geographical, economic, and architectural, that were articulated in South Asia or critically examined there, and that by 3 generations of artists. You can read their names here, from the 1940s onwards. So the exhibition focused either on works from the region or from elsewhere, but that used South Asia as a pivotal axis. So contrary to the Catalyst Art exhibition, which proceeds in the exhibition space primarily through visual affinities and comparisons, here what I did in some cases at least was to look at connections between different artists who knew each other or worked with each other. So I had a series of photographs by Isamu Noguchi, and you can see details here, who was a friend of Buckminster Fuller. They first met in 1929, and Noguchi first visited India in 1949. This is when he takes these photographs. He arrives to Bombay via Italy, Greece, and Egypt, and tours the country's main sites, main architectural sites, for about 4 months. He's fascinated by the Delhi and Jaipur Jantar Mantar. He photographs them. These are reproduced soon afterwards, and they would most importantly continue to inspire his work in a very direct way, very much for the next decades to come. He returned to India afterwards too. In the mid-1980s, he represented the United States at the Venice Pavilion, and just in front, in this sort of open courtyard that you have in front of the pavilion, he located his work, The Slide Mantra, which is directly inspired by one of the instruments. Nevertheless, the designs that he realized for India, most of them, or that he designed for India, most of them remained unrealized. And I think this is perhaps because of that, and his deep engagement with the place is actually less known. Another historical note in the exhibition was the relationship between Muzarul Islam, Muhammad Kibriya, and Novera Ahmed. So while, if you will, Noguchi first went to Paris on his way to India, Novera made the reverse journey. She left East Pakistan in the 1960s and settled in Paris, where she remained for most of her life. The exhibition actually included works by Ahmed, so these are the two works on the left, of course, that remained in Bangladesh after she left for Paris. What they do is that they really attest to the modernist impulse that she developed while she was studying at the Camberwell College of Arts under Jacob Epstein. And they're very much indebted to this post-war humanist tradition. You can see how she's exploring abstracted representations of the human life, the fragility of colliding and falling skeletal figures or human bonds. And here I think I have a detail of this work. One of Ahmed's early institute reliefs was made for the public library in Dhaka, now the Dhaka University Library, a building designed by Muzarul Islam, which was documented in the exhibition. Islam did absolutely stunning drawings, and I was fortunate to be able to display 4 of them in the exhibition. This early work, that is Islam's public library, together with the College of Arts and Crafts, as you may know, were really transformative for the cityscape of Dhaka when these were made in the 1950s. As a repository of knowledge and, of course, also a site of symbolic exchange between local and worldly cultures, the library also embodies the philosophy that would mark Islam's lifelong commitment to broadening the role of architecture. And architectural imagination, more broadly speaking, is one of the connectors in that exhibition. One of Islam's, here you can see that this was made, the maquette was made recently for the exhibition just before. One of Islam's residential projects was the house that he built for the artist Muhammad Kibriya, whose work was also included in the exhibition. And here you have a series of prints that Kibriya made either in Japan or on his return from Japan. So after joining as a faculty member the College of Arts and Crafts in Dhaka, he decides to resume his education, his formation, and he spends about 3 years from 1959 to 62 at Tokyo's University of the Arts. And that time in Japan for Kibriya is really an opener onto Japanese printing techniques, pictorial traditions, and Zen philosophy. He's inspired especially by the Zen gardens of Kyoto. You can see that quite directly in this work titled Garden. But Japan, interestingly, also serves for him as a relay for international art, which he witnesses, which he encounters at first sight while he is in Japan. So not only for Japanese art per se. The exhibition also paid homage to Lala Rook, who passed away, as you know, in 2017, after having accepted to be part of this exhibition. Rook's mirror image and nightscape series, or part of these series, were included in the exhibition, and they really speak to her drive to deconstruct landscape. So really taking drawing at its edge with these near monochrome, black monochromes that still have white lines that percolate across the surface and create, at least to me, a paradoxical impression of luminosity when you witness them. These are relatively small-scale works. The digital render is, of course, here something that doesn't pay justice to them. Playing with this notion of scale, in front of Noguchi's photographs at the very entrance of the show, I included Zarina's work, The 10,000 Things, which is a miniature rescaling of some of her works in reference, of course, to Marcel Duchamp's Breton Valise. And this is an archival project that consists of reproductions of her works and symbolizes, from that perspective, the artist's mental universe and also life trajectory. As you know, she studied woodblock printing in Bangkok and Tokyo, and in Talia in Paris with Stanley William Heiter at Atelier 17 in the 1960s. And throughout her career, she borrowed from very different artistic traditions, ranging from Urdu literature and calligraphy to Japanese printmaking and Zen Buddhism. Moving now to a younger generation of artists included in the exhibition. Zahir Shah's drawing of Golconda is what you can see here on the right-hand side. So this is an artist who's featured in both exhibitions and with whom I have worked over time. The building here that you see of Golconda is part of these single utopias that she focuses on, so single moments of idealism. It is made, as you can see, of broad horizontal lines that transform the facade into a sort of a light and quasi-dissolving mass. So historically speaking, as you may know, the Golconda dormitory was built for Sri Aurobindo in Pondicherry and completed in 1949. It's designed by Antonin Himon's architectural office in Tokyo, and it's said to have pioneered the use of reinforced concrete in the region while also presenting original design solutions, especially in relation to climate. Aisha Sultana is best known for her drawings, but I was very lucky to be able to include, thanks to Pratik and Priyanka, a photographic work of hers. Here are some details. Her Threshold series is comprised of torn and scratched photographs taken the world over of either unidentified landscapes, national monuments and memorials, this is one here in Egypt, and the roads and airports that connect them. It's also a very personal work, knowing that most of these photographs were taken in the Gulf region by her father while he was posted in Kuwait shortly before the first war. And others, especially those from Pakistan, are all found images. The exhibition also included collages by the Istanbul-based Hera Buyuktasyan that take Amrita's Golden Temple as a starting point, as well as new works representative of her inquiry into fluvial routes. She's particularly interested in how these form connecting channels over centuries. She's also investigated the global economy of marble, and here you can see how these sort of white mosaics stand in for these sort of connecting interests of hers. Desmond Lazaro's work was made especially for the exhibition and was inspired by Fuller's non-hierarchical approach to space and geography. They included drawings, that's what you can see in the background, a Dymaxion map, and above one that is folded into an icosahedron mobile. So the Dymaxion map, which was first published as sort of a DIY kit in Life magazine in 1943, is basically a mental construction based on an alternative comprehension of the world, which abandons the Mercator projection and its use as the equator as the reference line. So its aim is to minimize the distortions of conventional representations of the Earth and their embedded cultural biases. In addition, Lazaro sets his family history of migration that I previously mentioned against the great maritime journeys of Vasco da Gama, Cristoforo Colombo, Fernand de Magalhães, and James Cook, which he superposes onto these maps. It's a short, looped film that condenses in short millennia from, I quote, the newly born Earth to the Cro-Magnon man. And you can see how the paintings are arranged in the sort of a cyclorama according to this old-fashioned mode of display. Outside the main gallery was Provenance, a film that traces in reverse, so following, of course, the provenance of an artworks, of the networks of ownership and interdependency that create the market value of a single design. That is the chair that Pierre Jeanneret created for Chandigarh. And you move, in short, from the rarefied homes of collectors in Europe back to Chandigarh via the auction house, the restorers, the cargo ships that bring these chairs to Europe. One of the editions of Provenance was put on sale at Christie's in its post-war and contemporary auction, and the work also includes a film that portrays that and thus inserts or helps explain how the work was inserted into that very market and network of ownership. And one of the reasons, I'm finishing here, one of the reasons why it was important for me to include this work in the exhibition is that it foregrounds ongoing historical and socioeconomic tensions and inequalities. In addition, and this is perhaps not a coincidence, this was the first time that these works were shown in were shown in the region, though they were primarily shot in Chandigarh. I say this more generally. The fact that many works that were either made in India or inspired by it are still very infrequently seen here is something I find important to highlight. And it's probably one of the symptoms of this ongoing imbalance. And this leads me to a point that I raised in my work more broadly, which is that a history of artistic mobilities and transfers that puts basically an emphasis on exchanges and, broadly speaking, if you will, positive outcomes, should also be attuned to historical disjunctures, which have, in short, forced people into contact. In regard to contemporary art, the complex experience of citizenship, which I addressed in the first exhibition at Kettle's Yard, has impacted, of course, as we know, many artists in the region and elsewhere too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Devika. So one of the important facets of the hub is also really to go into the depths of exhibition making, but also discourse production. And in this case, it felt like to have these two quite key recent exhibitions bring us into this discussion also of what does it really mean to be today a South Asian curator who has, in a way, been practicing academically in many, yes, but in many parts of the world. That's what I'm kind of trying to highlight, because how do we sort of also get away from some of the essentialisms that at times come with these sort of positions of being working with South Asian practitioners, working with diasporic South Asian protagonists. You know, and academically, you've sort of done very rigorous work that moves these anchor points, as I said, away also from just this kind of nexus of South Asia geographically into sort of distant terrains, and really looking at the political backgrounds, the colonial history that accompanied these exchanges. And so I'm just wondering how in your new role, where you're at Tate, how do you plan to carry these research commitments with you, while also perhaps having the mandate of building collections, or at least offering to a larger public these histories of the region?
I actually think that my joining an institution that has a collection is very much part of what I'm doing. The reason for that is because that allows us to look not only at South Asian art in its own right, but really at how to connect South Asian art with artworks made across the world. And that's something which I did in my exhibition in Dhaka, but only, of course, through very precise and focused examples, and something that you can do on a much bigger scale once you're in an institution and one that has an international collection. So I see these things really as complementary.
I was also wondering if you could share a little bit more about, say, an example like the Marg issue, where you've put together so much sort of research that maybe was occluded to an extent, also bringing different writers and artists into relation, and how Marg itself has really been one of those key platforms of knowledge circulation beyond essentialisms for us. So it would be great to think about how you entered that editorially.
How I entered it editorially. What was interesting is that I both use Mark as a source and as an example in my writing. So looking back at early editions of Mark, so Mark was created in 1946, as you know, and looking, so I've written about the first decades of it. And then what you're referring to is the issue that I guest edited much more recently, 2 years ago. That was in itself something interesting for me. Of course, as you said, Mark was a critical platform, and it has been and is, I believe, again. Historically speaking, research-wise, what I was interested in is to see how it served for the circulation of international art in India. We just know just how much publications have been part of that story, and it's not an Indian story, it's a story of the former periphery. That mattered a great deal to me. The issue that I guest edited was on France-India relations, and I was trying to look much more specifically at connections between Indian artists and with France also being sort of a pivotal axis here. There's a text by Novera Ahmad, there's a text on Jean Bhavnagri, and on many other artists and cultural producers such as Bhavnagri. I'm very happy that you're highlighting my research. I should say that this is, of course, a collaborative exercise. It's a guest-edited issue. And something that is really important to me is how much still needs to be written about South Asian art, Indian art, but not only, and therefore how much, in this particular context, art history and curatorial practices have to go together, because there's so much research that still needs to be done, so many histories that still need to be unearthed and written about, and curatorial practice cannot be done without that art historical research, to which I'm contributing to and to which a number of other people are contributing to today. Magazines are really important for that. Publications are important for that. Mark, but not only, and there are many of you here who are actively involved in that. So the journal is one of these critical platforms in the past and today, and one of the different outlets, and here I'm talking about publishing and writing, that contribute to an ongoing work that pertains to trying as much as is possible, not necessarily to recreate a history in a holistic way, that is not possible, but to try to create some of these narratives, which will then perhaps produce counter-narratives. But in the case of South Asia, in many cases, we don't have the original narratives to begin with to counter them.
Great. We're open for questions.
I'm going to ramble a bit before I arrive to a question, but it kind of triggers lots of different thoughts. Coming down to architectural modernism and actually its legacy within South Asia, it's interesting because Seher Shah features in both exhibitions, but also to think about modernism as an impulse of utopia, an impulse of aspiration, and while
Aisha doesn't feature in both.
No, I'm just responding. I'm not. Yeah.
Seher. Oh, I misheard.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
But to also acknowledge the fact that while these structures were being built, the inflow of refugees into India, into Bangladesh were like massive. Mm-hmm. And thereby to also think of architectural modernism as also a form of exclusion, a form of violence, a form of waiting. The second thing, of course, is to think about the relationship of architectural modernism to a certain kind of display of citizenship, a typology of time. So once the refugees are in, what do we do with the time, since job creation wasn't that great? So we end up building museums, and we have shopping centers, and we have parks. We're also talking about a time when we are thinking about space aspirations, particularly in India and Bangladesh. So we're looking at parks with like these beautiful rocket-shaped like toys for children to kind of like move towards a certain kind. So everything is upward. The entire impulse is upward. When we bring works like Seher, for example, into, and not just Seher, but actually there are lots of people, and in the demolition of the Hall of Nations, there's been a trigger. It's a watershed moment for so many people to rethink modernism.
Zahir did the work actually on the Hall of Nations.
Yes, and particularly I'm wondering how can we bring in the ideas, of course there is, while we are talking about nostalgia, while we're talking about function, while we're talking about utility and aspiration, how can we also acknowledge within exhibitions the form of modernist architecture, the form of violence, as a form that completely erased a native architectural style, but also in a way was a form of exclusion. That's particularly what I'm getting at.
I think it's more comment than a question, so thank you for your comment. What I should say is that, building on what I earlier said, writing platforms that are discursive are extremely important and work hand in hand with curatorial practices. And I think a lot of what you're saying has to do with that different output. I can only display in an exhibition what artists are doing. And that's why I mentioned Zahir Shah's work on the Hall of Nations, because she's addressing quite directly some of what you said, not all of it.
There you go. Can you hear me? So thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question about a different type of migration. I mean, I'm American coming from the United States and know that the highest earning immigrants in the United States, I believe, are coming from South Asia, specifically Indian Americans. Americans of Indian
number you said? I can't hear you.
Americans of Indian origin are among the highest earning immigrants into the United States. And so when I've gone to galleries and shows in the US, specifically to see the South Asian works on display, it is often diaspora or Americans of South Asian origin who are there and who are collecting. And so my question is,
Collecting or
how
viewing?
do, sorry?
Collecting or viewing exhibitions?
Both. But, and then, definitely buying and also viewing. So how do diaspora, how do they complicate or provide opportunity or maybe have no influence on the really compelling statement you made about cosmopolitanism, such that South Asian work doesn't have to travel to have value, but what you find, or what I've found, is that a lot of times it is the diaspora recognizing the South Asianness of work, the Indian, taking pride in collecting. I collect Indian contemporary work, or I collect Bangladeshi contemporary work. Does that make sense, that question?
I understand your question, absolutely. Thank you. Something I should say that is important to me is that South Asian art should be displayed in collections, not only for South Asian audiences. And this is why how one exhibits them not only in an exhibition, which can only do so much, but within the collection is crucial. And I'm very happy if South Asian audiences relate to these, but the primary goal is that international audiences, especially in diverse places like New York, London, and elsewhere, are able to relate to South Asian art and understand the different connections between these. Of course, there are a number of supporters in the region for art of the region and also in its diaspora, and I think this is a positive thing. I also see a lot of South Asian art being collected, and this is what you're referring to, by collectors outside the region. And there are a number of gallerists who could tell you that most of the artworks they sell are being sold to international collectors the world over. So it's actually a little bit more complicated, and it depends, of course, also of what specific currents, what specific artists you're talking about. But when one is thinking of contemporary art, it is actually really an international collector spaces, I believe, that gallerists are working with. But to be honest, I'm not the best person in the room to talk about this, and this is a question that should be directed to Pratik and Priyanka.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I mean, the idea of that diasporic community is supporting art from the region that it comes from is now not really that relevant for us. I'm speaking from personal thing. But there is support from all aspects of the community, not just Indians buying Indian art, but people from all over the world. Priyanka?
Also, it's a lot to do with the artists who now don't locate themselves to nationality anymore. Many artists from all over the world, not South Asia alone, don't want their nationality to be the binding factor on how they're collected within institutions or privately. For example, I'm just sort of trying to explain this further. So most museums in the world, so the Tate, for example, has certain sectional acquisition committees. So there will be a South Asian acquisitions committee, a Minasa acquisition, North American acquisition committee, and so on. And of course, there's also the global committee, which is a different body. And artists of a certain caliber and type, I mean, if they have practiced in a certain sense of immersion, they don't think their nationality should decide whether the museum wants their work or not. So then galleries work accordingly, and then the institutions respond accordingly, I think. But I know there's still a mile to go, but that's where it is.
I think you have to differentiate here how works get acquired and then what is being done by curators and by institutions once they're displayed. And these are slightly two different things.
I guess I'm the default person to do this, but just wondering what kind of interrogation there might be going on within institutions like the Tate and others in defining South Asia even, right? Because there are more of us here, obviously, than India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, but that really is sort of the crux of the history that is out there, I suppose. I completely realize there are challenges, louder on the mic. Can I? The volume. I'm sure there are challenges, but I was just wondering what possibilities you might identify in terms of sort of defining, expanding that purview. So on an institutional capacity, but also I'm wondering what people can do like on individual capacities, because we do navigate these institutions and between institutions and other spaces, so yeah.
Thank you. There are many questions in that. The first thing I should say is that I'm personally, and I don't think Tate is trying to define South Asia. Absolutely not. In fact, my title, though my work is primarily pertains to South Asia, my title is Curator International Art. And what I, in a collaborative capacity, very much so collaboratively do with colleague, is to create bridges between South Asian art and artworks from different regions, including North America and Europe, and also of different media. So it can help, and here we're really part of a network of institutions, and I hope a network that comes back here, that is not only a Western network, something at least that is very important to me. We're just one institution that is trying to build a much more diverse, international, and plural way of looking at art, including, of course, at art of the region. I personally, and I belonged before that, before being at Tate, to the Center of South Asian Studies of the University of Cambridge. So this notion of South Asia is recurrent. And there are, of course, different understandings of it, which can be as broad as possible. I would certainly be in favor of that. So trying to be, again, when one is looking more specifically at geographical units, within these units to be as diverse as possible, but also as precise, looking at the hierarchies within these, at whether it's indigenous art practices, other types of art practices that may not have been looked into enough. One person, one institution can only do so much. So I think the importance of network is really important. Something else I should say is that these plural, these multi-centered new art histories, new ways of connecting art should happen, I believe so, not only in Europe and North America, because that would raise a number of other issues that we know, but also here. And that's why, and that's something that Natasha was mentioning in her introduction. That's why in my own work, I also bring artists who use South Asia, as I mentioned, as a pivotal axis, but also bring these international artists, some of them at least, here. And we're starting to have much more art from elsewhere displayed, which used to be the case in India at least. And I think this is a good thing, how one had to move away from national narratives or Western-centered narratives, not only in Europe and North America, but also from nationally focused narratives here, because the two have to go hand in hand.
Thank you, Devika.
Thank you, Natasha.